Good morning and welcome. Praise God, our Lord Jesus Christ. We want to bless His whole name. He has been so good unto us. He has done mighty and great things for us. That's why we want to bless Him. That's why we want to glorify Him. I welcome you to this class today. Today I want us to discuss about vegetation of East Africa. And when we're talking about vegetation, we're simply looking at the natural vegetation cover of East Africa. We know very well that the natural vegetation cover of East Africa, we are looking at the natural plant cover on the surface of the earth, plant growth on the surface of the earth. This natural vegetation cover of East Africa is just as varied as the climate that we have just finished looking at. And you realize that there is a direct relationship between climate and vegetation distribution. Some people would say that one influences the other, for it even becomes difficult to ascertain which one comes first. Is it vegetation? Is it the soil? Is it climate first? Because climate influences vegetation growth. Vegetation will influence the nature of climate in an area. So the distribution of vegetation cover in East Africa is highly varied and highly influenced by climate. East Africa's vegetation is highly we have already said it's highly varied, and the major vegetation types of course include the forests. And when we talk about forests here, we are referring to the low altitude, or what we call lowland forests. These are the ones which are found growing at altitude lower than 1,500 meters above sea level. And also the high altitude forests, for example, those ones which grow at higher altitudes, mountain peaks, those ones we find at altitudes above 1,500, 2,000 meters above sea level. The Mount Elgon forest, for example, mountain forest on Mount Kenya, the Mount Rwenzori forests, and all those forests that are found at high altitude. We have a Chuya forest in the Buindi and the Buindi impenetrable forest in southwestern Uganda. These ones are high altitude forests. Then we have woodland vegetation, and here we'll be talking about vegetation that is characterized with abundance of tree cover, but it's not sufficient to form a canopy, and therefore you cannot refer to it as a forest because it cannot form a canopy. We had the famous woodlands in East Africa. We have the Miombo woodlands in central Tanzania, which have been used for wildlife conservation. Then we have the grassland vegetation. For example, we talk about the Masai land, which is typically grassland. We have the Serengeti Plains of Kenya. We have the Maxoni Falls National Park of Uganda, Queen Elizabeth National Park, and the greater part of the East African plateau is made up of grassland vegetation. Of course, when we talk about grassland here, we are referring to a type of vegetation where grass dominates all the other cover, and therefore it's not entirely grass, but it is the dominant, because under regionalization we look at the dominant characteristic. So grass is the dominant cover in this vegetation, and that's why we call it the grassland vegetation. So when we talk about the bushland vegetation, then there is the other one. Here we're looking at bush, and here is characterized by thickets and grass. Bushland vegetation is different from grassland because under bush you will find kind of vegetation growing with small trees that are with their branches forking and intertwined together, that it becomes impenetrable even for you to go through them. A thicket, I have shared some photos. You look at the thickets, for example, and the grass bushland. Then we also have semi-arid and arid vegetation. This is vegetation that is characteristic of the dry land areas, like northern Kenya, like northeastern Uganda, areas that receive rainfall of less than 250 millimeters per annum. So those are the areas that we'll be looking at that are characterized with semi-arid vegetation. And semi-arid vegetation, of course, when you look at its characteristics, it's a vegetation that is found of short and stunted trees. Some of them will have small leaves, others do not have leaves at all, because they are created in a way that they are able to adapt to the dry conditions so that they are able to minimize water loss. That's why they have the small leaves. That's why they have the thick barks. So we have that temperate, the semi-arid vegetation. Then the temperate vegetation, the one which is found on the peaks. Temperate vegetation found on the peaks, on mountains, at altitude above 2,700 at 2,700 meters above sea level. You find temperate vegetation. For example, the heath and moorland found on mountain peaks. This is temperate vegetation. This is heath and moorland. So the heath and moorland, for example, found in the mountains, this is temperate vegetation. The bamboo is temperate vegetation. It's very common on Mount Elgon and Kenya and Kilimanjaro and other mountains of East Africa. And then, of course, lastly, we look at the mangrove, which is found at the East African coast. The mangrove, sometimes we call them mangrove forests because they are made up of small trees that grow within at the continental shelf of the ocean. They are very common at the East African coast and make an entire stretch all the way from southern Tanzania up to the Horn of Africa, or that's the border at the coast of Somalia. That entire stretch is made up of mangrove, depending on the characteristics of a given area, because there are certain conditions which also favor the growth of mangrove forests. So having looked at the types of vegetation that are found in these areas, then we need to understand the factors for their distribution. One of them is climate, and under climate we are looking at rainfall and temperature, because we know that rainfall and temperature are the most important elements of weather as far as plant growth is concerned. So areas that receive high rainfall amounts and high temperatures are characterized with luxuriant tree growth, and therefore these are areas where you find the tropical rainforests. The tropical rainforests of luxuriant growth, growing with a lot of vigor, made up of tall trees with huge trunks, with evergreen throughout the year. This is typical of areas with high rainfall, high temperature, the equatorial zone. But when you go to areas where there are high temperatures and limited rainfall, then those are the areas where you find the semi-desert vegetation. Vegetation that is struggling to minimize water loss. So this vegetation has small leaves. These small leaves are meant to minimize the loss of water, the loss of moisture, because there is already insufficiency in these areas. Areas which receive low rainfall, low temperature, these are areas of temperate vegetation. The ones I'm talking about, the bamboo, the heath and moorland, the ones which are found at higher altitudes, because the rainfall and the temperature does not allow for luxuriant growth of vegetation. So eventually you'll find that you have more heath, more bamboo, more moorland in these areas. That is climate. Then the other factor is soils. Soils is very important as far as plant growth is concerned. So sometimes an area may be receiving sufficient rainfall, but when it has very poor soils, and therefore eventually because of the poor soils that it has, what it happens is that the vegetation grows poorly because of the nature of the soils. Therefore, soils become very important as far as plant growth is concerned. In areas where we find luxuriant tree growth, it means those areas have got substantial amount of nutrients in those in the soils. But also areas where we find poor plant growth, then we know there's attributed to nutrients. Just like as human beings, when you have good feeding, you find you are healthy, you grow fat, you grow big because you have good feeding. But if you are feeding poorly, like some of my friends here, I know them, I'll not mention their names, but you will know that your appearance, even your physical appearance, will be, you look malnourished. You've seen the children in the villages who look malnourished. The other day when we went for field work in those villages of eastern Uganda, you saw how the kids were looking. Like some of them were looking really malnourished because of the poor feeding that they are going through, they are undertaking. Then we have the drainage. Drainage here, we are looking at water bodies, basically the distribution of water bodies, the areas, and then in terms of availability of water, are the soils under water logging or they are not under water logging. If there is a lot of water in an area, then you know the kind of vegetation that it develops. You just look at our water pond there at a mini campus at near the police station. Because of the water around it, the vegetation has started to grow around it, and the vegetation which is growing there is characteristics of vegetation we find in the swamps. So you find swampy vegetation in areas of permanent water logging. You find the vegetation because water loving plants grow in areas which have water, things like papyrus, things like palms, areas which have water. But there are also those ones which grow in areas of no water. And we also realize that the availability of water will determine the characteristics of the resultant vegetation. Acacia, for example, is typical of semi-arid vegetation. But if acacia finds a chance of growing near a water body, that acacia you will find that it will be more luxuriant than the acacia that grows in areas of no water. So you realize that it's the characteristics of the vegetation will vary depending on the nature of the amount of water. I will give you the example. Those of you if you have ever crossed Karuma Bridge, my friends from Arua, maybe you've ever crossed it, and others. When you are moving along that entire stretch, if you follow that entire narrow river all the way up to Para, along the river there is luxuriant tree growth. But as you move away from the river, the vegetation changes to stunted trees, to grass, because the water is insufficient. Then we have activities of man, human activities. Man is both destructive and constructive. Man can affect vegetation distribution through his activities of afforestation. Man has planted a lot of trees. We have a lot of planted vegetation. I don't want you to call it artificial because we don't have artificial vegetation. All vegetation that is growing out of the soil is natural vegetation. But we can only differentiate that this is natural occurring, this is planted. So man has planted a lot of trees. Everywhere you go, you find planted forests. For example, in Katugo there in Nakasongola, you find a huge planted forest. When you go to these slopes of Mount Elgon, you find a huge planted tree forest. When you move around the country in all the swamps, you find planted trees. So this is man distributing influencing vegetation distribution. But man can also be destructive. We know how many forests man has cut down. Man has destroyed forests all over East Africa. Through road construction, they have to clear forests. Through settlements, they have to clear forests. Through agriculture, they clear forests to create land. You remember very well, I know you were still young, something around 2007, when the government of Uganda had the plan to give away part of the land of the present-day Mavera forest to sugarcane growers. What the Ugandan population did was to riot, because government was prioritizing agriculture over conservation. So we clear forests. That's in such a way we are influencing vegetation distribution. So activities of man, mining, all these activities of man which lead to clearance of vegetation. And swamp reclamation is an activity of man that is influencing vegetation distribution. The other factor, of course, is altitude. And under altitude here we are looking at height above sea level. Height above sea level is important, very important in such a way that man, I beg your pardon, in such a way that vegetation, because height above sea level influences the distribution of temperature, the vertical distribution of temperature. That's why we end up saying that the higher you go, the cooler it becomes. But we have said that for vegetation to grow luxuriant, there must be sufficient vegetation, there must be sufficient temperature and sufficient rainfall. So the rainfall and the temperature vary with the height above sea level. So that's why when you look at vegetation zonation along a mountain or a slope, you look at that you have savanna at the base of the mountain, you have the tropical rainforest somewhere in between, you move on to the temperate, you move on to heath and moorland, you move on to bare rock as you move. So that is altitude. Then we have government policy. Governments also come up with policies. For example, the one of gazetting areas for conservation. We know very well that we have so many gazetted areas of conservation in East Africa. We have the Serengeti National Park, we have the Masai Mara, we have the Kilimanjaro, we have the Mount Kenya, we have Savo, we have Queen Elizabeth, we have Murchison Falls, Kidepo Valley, Lake Mburo. All these ones a national park, Kivu National Park in Rwanda, all these ones, the Miombo woodlands, the Ngorongoro Caldera a conservation area, all these areas have been conserved, and therefore those areas you find them with vegetation naturally occurring, because government has come up with a policy to prohibit man from occupying those areas, from practicing other activities in those areas, so that such that conservation takes place, and in turn government is influencing vegetation distribution. But the government can also decide to degazette. We know very well in areas, I've just given the example where the government of Uganda wanted to degazette Mavira forest for sugarcane growing. Government can degazette land for irrigation farming. Government can degazette wetlands for irrigation farming. Government can degazette areas for resettlement of people. They have just been resettling people from Bududa who are being resettled in Bulambuli. That area where they are being resettled was formerly land for something else. It was some kind of a plain with a grassland. Now people have come. The vegetation which is going to be there is going to be different due to settlement of people in that area. So that is government policy, and so on and so forth. What are the benefits of our vegetation? And basically here, look, vegetation, natural vegetation, forests, trees, plants. What are the benefits? These benefits are both economic, they are also and ecological. Among the economic benefits, of course, we have timber, source of timber. Timber is a very important resource because it's used in the furniture making industry. We have the poles, which are used for transmission of electricity and also construction poles. We have employment opportunities. People work as in the sawmills, people who work in the timber yards, people who work as game rangers, forest rangers. All these are people employed in the forest sector, in the benefiting from the natural vegetation of East Africa. We have foreign exchange through exportation of forest products. We export forest products, timber, pulp. We export many other things. There is industrialization as a result, because some forestry products are raw materials. We have the pulp industries, paper and pulp industries located in Jinja here and many other parts of the country. So we also have diversification of the economy, that with our forests we do not have only to depend on tourism, we do not only have to depend on agriculture. When agriculture fails, we look on to forests, so that forests can help us to cover the deficit in our revenue collection. Then we have the forest, our vegetation is also a tourist attraction. You know, our earning in terms of tourism, a lot of money is earned by East African countries from the tourism sector, because people come here, they are attracted to our flora and fauna. Forests are also used for camping and recreation. Those of you who go to Eastern Uganda, you see that there's a campsite there in Mabira Forest and many other parts. Maybe some of you have ever gone for a camp somewhere, camping expedition, and you camp somewhere close nearby a forest or within a forest. Then we also have, it's a source of herbs. My brothers here, you know the famous herb, power bank, Mlondo, Kizimuland, Joel must be knowing, as well as Uboja. You have known, and Patrick, you know this Mlondo here. The ladies also, you know, your herbs, the ones you get from the forests. For the men, I don't know whether Mkama and Ayamba also comes from these forest herbs, but the women, you also have, you know, your herbs. That's where the Baganda women go to fetch firewood in the forests. So we have herbs, a source of, but then food. I know many of us, those of us who study at many campuses, you know, at many campuses we are well endowed with guavas. Although we compete with the monkeys, but forests, trees provide fruits to us, to human beings. There are mangoes, there are guavas, there are oranges, there are wild grapes. I don't know if you've ever eaten, and berries. I don't know if you've ever eaten them. These days, due to deforestation, they are quite a rare occurrence. We have these things, I don't know how we call them, I've forgotten the English name. But the Waganda call it entuntunu, something like that. These days they are very common on the streets of Kampala. But they are just harvested in the wilderness. Some people grow them, but basically they are wild plants. So we have such a source of food. We have these tubers which we eat, the yams that we harvest from these areas, from the wilderness, and we eat. So they are a source of food. Ecologically, forests or vegetation is used to modify the climate. They are very good at modifying the climate because they are the greatest. They are one of the second after open water bodies reservoirs of moisture to the atmosphere. And you know, through the process of evapotranspiration, water evaporates from the trees, plants, and other vegetation into the atmosphere. It condenses to form clouds and later comes back as rainfall. So in such a way, it is helping to modify the climate. Then we also say it helps to control soil erosion. Soil erosion, you know, soil erosion, one of the greatest control mechanisms is planting trees. My people who live in the slopes of Elgon and Kabale area, they know very well how they have managed this. That to control erosion on the slopes, you need to plant either grass bands or tree cover on the slopes, because the tree leaves, the tree roots help to bind the soil together and eventually control loss of topsoil. So vegetation also works as windbreakers. Those of us who are farmers, we know there is a tendency of growing trees around our farms. You go to the tea estates in Chenjojo there and Fort Portal, you'll find trees around the farms and many other areas. But the purpose of these trees are to help to control the wind. If you're a banana farmer, you need to plant trees around your plantation so that they help to control the wind. You know, when the wind comes and finds when your mattock has it's just beginning to yield, it may put all of it down, and yet it's not yet mature. Then we also have the other benefit, that's the habitat for wild animals and other forms of wildlife. These animals are both plant animals and insects. You know very well a forest like Mabira is home to thousands of butterflies and other insects. Then the animals which are found in this forest, the monkeys. We have our monkeys here at campus, which are very good friends. They live with us. We have the squirrels. We have the baboons. And those guys, if you've ever passed the system, you've seen those baboons. Or at Karuma, you've seen baboons. Or in Kivale, when you're going to Chenjojo, you've seen those baboons when you're going to Fort Portal. So these baboons, they live in those areas, and several others. You know, you guys, you have these things you call totem. All of them live in the wilderness. The snakes, the monkeys, the antelopes, all these ones, they depend. The elephants, the lions, they depend on the natural habitat, the vegetation for their natural habitat. So below here we have the map of East Africa, which is talking about vegetation distribution. Of course, where you see green, that's where we are having the equatorial vegetation, or this evergreen. That's the way we have the highest concentration forest cover. You can see at the coast of East Africa we have that green. That green is depicting the mangrove vegetation. When you come to the northern Kenya, you see northern Kenya and northeastern Uganda, how it's painted. That's the area where you have areas which are experiencing aridity, and the parts of central Tanzania, they're also experiencing aridity. These other areas here are experiencing aridity, and so you will find that those are areas which are characterized with the same arid vegetation. This photo here depicts a grassland in East Africa. Of course, the animals in the background, these ones are grazing because this is an area of conservation. This is a typical grassland. The grass is the dominant cover, with of course scattered trees. If there is no grazing of animals, this grass can grow even as tall as most of you here in this class, because the grass can grow up to 2 meters. The grass can grow up to 2 meters.